The clash in the Libyan desert, a turning point in World War II. As dawn broke over the Libyan desert in 1941, two of history's greatest military forces squared off in a duel that would reshape World War II. On one side stood Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, whose lightning-fast armored strikes had earned him fame on the battlefields of France. Facing him was the British Eighth Army, the Desert Rats, a tough, resourceful band of warriors who would prove to be his most formidable opponents. Their clash would unfold across thousands of miles of merciless desert, where tanks dueled like battleships at sea, and the difference between victory and annihilation often came down to a single radio intercept, or a few drops of fuel. The 5 battles that followed weren't just tactical contests. They were a test of will and ingenuity that would determine the fate of North Africa, the Suez Canal, and ultimately, the outcome of World War II itself. While the world's attention focused on the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain, these two armies fought a different kind of war, one where soldiers battled not just each other, but also the scorching sun, choking sandstorms, and the constant specter of death by thirst. This is their story, a tale of genius and desperation, triumph and disaster, and the men who fought one of history's most extraordinary campaigns in one of Earth's most unforgiving places. Operation Compass, a bold British strategy in the desert. Richard O'Connor stood in his command tent on December 8, 1940, studying a map of the Western Desert. His superiors had tasked him with an impossible mission: attack an Italian army 6 times larger than his own forces. But O'Connor, a wiry Scotsman with a fighter's instinct, saw something his Italian opponents had missed. Between their fortified camps lay vast expanses of open desert, perfect for a surprise attack if you were bold enough to try it. The British struck like lightning. O'Connor's men slipped through the desert gaps at night, their tanks and trucks appearing like ghosts behind Italian lines. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, the Italian commander, had built his defenses to withstand a frontal assault that never came. Instead, the British 7th Armoured Division, soon to be nicknamed the Desert Rats, swept around his flanks, cutting supply lines and sowing chaos. At Sidi Barrani, the first major clash, Italian resistance crumbled in hours. What began as a 5-day raid transformed into one of the most decisive victories in British military history. The numbers tell a staggering story. With just 36,000 men, O'Connor's forces captured or destroyed nearly 10 Italian divisions, over 130,000 troops. British tanks pursued the retreating Italians across hundreds of miles of desert, taking so many prisoners that they couldn't spare enough guards to watch them all. The Italian 10th Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. In Cairo, champagne corks popped as the British celebrated their first major victory of World War II. But amid the jubilation, a few prescient officers worried about rumors from Berlin. Hitler had just appointed a new commander to salvage the Axis position in North Africa, an aggressive, unconventional general named Erwin Rommel. O'Connor's triumph had done more than shatter Italian power in North Africa. It had demonstrated that desert warfare required a new kind of fighting, rapid, fluid, and opportunistic. The wide open spaces weren't a barrier to movement, but a highway for those bold enough to use them. These lessons would prove prophetic in the battles to come, as both sides raced to master the art of mechanized warfare in an environment where speed and surprise meant everything. Operation Compass had set the stage for a contest between two of history's most innovative military minds, fought across one of its most unforgiving battlefields. The victory came at a crucial moment for Britain, standing alone against Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, desperate for good news to bolster British morale, declared it not a victory, but rather the end of an entire campaign. Yet even as London celebrated, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. The British had revealed their desert warfare tactics to a watchful German high command, and in the captured Italian equipment lay the beginnings of Rommel's future Afrika Korps, as German engineers studied how to adapt their own tanks and vehicles for desert combat. The Battle of Beda Fomm, a testament to audacity and strategy. In the freezing pre-dawn hours of February 5th, 1941, Major John Compton peered through his binoculars at an astonishing sight. Miles of Italian trucks, tanks, and artillery stretched before him. The entire remaining Italian army in Cyrenaica was attempting to escape along the coastal road. But Compton commanded just 2,000 men of the 7th Armored Division who had accomplished what the Italians thought impossible: a 150-mile dash across the desert to cut off their retreat. The next 24 hours would demonstrate how a tiny force could defeat an army through pure audacity. The British achievement bordered on the miraculous. While the main British forces pursued the Italians along the coast, General O'Connor had dispatched this small mobile group, Compton's Rifles, on a high-stakes gamble. They drove for 2 days straight across unmarked desert, navigating by sun compass, their trucks and tanks pushing through soft sand and rocky outcrops. The Italians, believing such a journey impossible, had left this southern escape route completely unguarded. Now Compton's men blocked the only path to safety, setting up a thin line of anti-tank guns and infantry positions across the coastal road at Beda Fomm. What followed was chaos incarnate. Wave after wave of desperate Italian forces slammed into the British position. Tanks charged forward only to be picked off by precise anti-tank fire. Italian infantry launched frenzied attacks, but were repelled by steady British rifle fire. The small British force, running desperately low on ammunition, held their ground through sheer determination. As one British sergeant later wrote, "We had no choice. The desert was behind us, the sea was on our left, and a whole bloody army was trying to run right over us." By nightfall, the coastal road had become a graveyard of burning vehicles stretching for miles. The Italians lost over 25,000 men captured, along with 1,500 vehicles and 112 tanks. This stunning victory marked the end of Italy's North African Empire and changed the entire character of desert warfare. It proved that small, mobile forces could defeat much larger armies through speed and surprise. But it also caught Hitler's attention. Within weeks, the first units of the Afrika Korps would arrive in Libya, and with them would come the Desert Fox himself. Beda Fomm's legacy lived on long after the war. Military historians would study how a force of just 2,000 men had managed to trap and destroy an army of 25,000. The battle became a textbook example of how mobility and position could trump sheer numbers. But perhaps its greatest impact was psychological. It gave the British Army a fierce confidence in desert warfare that would serve them well in the brutal battles to come. They had learned that in the desert, the bold and the fast could defeat the numerous and the powerful. Operation Crusader, the turning point in desert warfare. November 18, 1941, dawned with a thunderous roar as hundreds of British tanks surged across the Libyan desert. Operation Crusader had begun, the most ambitious British offensive yet, aimed at breaking Rommel's siege of Tobruk and destroying his Afrika Korps. But Rommel, the Desert Fox, had earned his nickname through cunning and had no intention of fighting the battle on British terms. As British forces advanced, they found only empty desert. The Fox was already moving to strike their exposed flank. What followed was unlike any battle in history, a swirling, chaotic tank duel across hundreds of square miles of open desert. traditional battle lines ceased to exist. Units lost contact with their headquarters, radio communications failed in the dust and confusion, and tank commanders fought their own private wars across the wasteland. British and German armored units circled each other like wary predators, striking and withdrawing, seeking advantage in the featureless terrain. The desert itself became a weapon, as blinding sandstorms concealed surprise attacks and tank tracks disappeared in the shifting sands. The turning point came in a moment of supreme irony. Rommel, believing he had outmaneuvered the British, launched a bold thrust toward Egypt. But his intuition, normally his greatest strength, had failed him. The British, learning from their previous defeats, had held a powerful reserve force back. As Rommel's tanks raced east, they ran headlong into fresh British armoured divisions. The resulting clash near Sidi Rezegh became the largest tank battle yet fought in North Africa. For 3 days, hundreds of tanks duelled at point-blank range, while the desert floor shook with explosions and the air filled with burning diesel smoke. The battle's climax demonstrated the razor's edge between victory and defeat in desert warfare. With his fuel running critically low, Rommel was forced to withdraw. The British, though bloodied, had achieved something remarkable. They had fought the Desert Fox to a standstill and forced him to retreat. More importantly, they had broken the spell of Rommel's invincibility. The siege of Tobruk was lifted, and for the first time, Allied forces had proven they could match German tactical prowess in open battle. But victory came at a staggering cost. The desert was littered with the burning hulks of over 800 tanks from both sides. Hundreds of young men lay dead beneath the scorching sun, their bodies already being covered by drifting sand. The battle had shown that modern warfare in the desert was a merciless equation of supply lines, mechanical reliability, and sheer endurance. The next phase of the Desert War would not be decided by tactical brilliance alone, but by which side could master the logistics of fighting in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The Desert Fox's tactical masterpiece, Battle of Gazala. Dawn on May 26, 1942 revealed an extraordinary sight. Rommel's entire Afrika Korps charging straight at the strongest point of the British defences. The British commanders smiled. The Desert Fox had finally made a fatal mistake. But while all eyes focused on this obvious threat, Rommel's real attack was already in motion. Under cover of darkness, his best units had swung wide through the desert in a maneuver so audacious that the British had considered it impossible. The British defensive line at Gazala was a marvel of military engineering. A 40-mile string of fortified boxes, bristling with anti-tank guns and artillery, backed by minefields and barbed wire. But Rommel had spotted its fatal flaw. The southern end of the line was anchored in empty desert. While his diversionary force pinned down British attention, his main armoured thrust swept through this undefended sector. By nightfall, German tanks were behind the entire British position, and the trap was sprung. What followed was Rommel's tactical masterpiece, the Battle of the Cauldron. Caught between the Afrika Korps and their own minefields, British armoured divisions launched desperate counterattacks. But Rommel had positioned his fearsome 88mm anti-tank guns with surgical precision. British tanks charging across open ground were decimated. The desert floor became a graveyard of burning Crusader and Valentine tanks, their crews baking in the merciless sun. Within days, the British 8th Army had lost over 500 tanks, and their entire defensive line began to unravel. The culmination came at Tobruk, the fortress port that had resisted Rommel for so long. This time, German attacks breached the defenses in less than 24 hours. The fall of Tobruk shocked the Allied world. Churchill learned of it while meeting with Roosevelt in Washington, calling it one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. In a single stroke, Rommel had captured 33,000 prisoners, 2,000 vehicles, and massive stockpiles of fuel and supplies. The path to Egypt lay open. But in the moment of his greatest triumph, the seeds of defeat were already present. The massive haul of British supplies temporarily masked a critical problem. Rommel's supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. His victory had carried him far beyond what his logistics could support. As his triumphant forces raced toward Egypt, fuel tanks ran dry and vehicles broke down. The Desert Fox had won his finest battle, but in doing so, he had set the stage for his own ultimate defeat at El Alamein. The turning point of the Desert War, El Alamein. General Bernard Montgomery stood atop his command vehicle on October 23, 1942, watching thousands of artillery pieces light up the night sky. Operation Lightfoot had begun, but this was no ordinary desert battle. For the first time, the British had assembled overwhelming force: 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and enough supplies to sustain weeks of combat. Across the lines, Rommel lay ill in Germany, his Afrika Korps running on empty, stripped of fuel and reinforcements by British naval superiority in the Mediterranean. The first phase was unlike anything seen before in the Desert War. Instead of the swirling tank battles of previous encounters, Montgomery had designed a methodical killing machine. Wave after wave of infantry advanced through German minefields at night, while engineers cleared paths for tanks to follow. The Germans called it Devil's Garden. Nearly 500,000 mines covered the approach. But Monty had planned for this, implementing a sophisticated mine-clearing operation that slowly but surely carved channels through the deadly fields. Then came the moment that would haunt Rommel, who had raced back to Africa at news of the attack. Operation Supercharge unleashed the full weight of British armor through the cleared lanes. The Afrika Korps fought back with characteristic skill, but for the first time in the Desert War, bravery and tactical brilliance weren't enough. British Sherman tanks, backed by overwhelming air support, ground forward relentlessly. German tanks, desperate for fuel, could barely maneuver. The Desert Fox found himself in an alien situation, unable to counterattack, forced to watch his command disintegrate under the sheer weight of Allied material. On November 4th, Rommel faced the hardest decision of his career. His fuel tanks were empty, his ammunition nearly gone. Hitler had radioed his usual victory or death order, but Rommel, for the first time, disobeyed. He would not sacrifice his men in a pointless last stand. The Great Retreat began as the Afrika Korps pulled back in good order, fighting desperate rearguard actions. Montgomery, cautious as ever, advanced steadily behind them. The Desert War had entered its final phase. El Alamein marked more than just a battle, it was the end of an era. Gone were the days of dashing cavalry-style tank battles across open desert. Modern industrial warfare had arrived in North Africa, where superior resources and logistics would trump even the most brilliant tactical maneuvers. As Churchill famously declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The Desert War had changed not just the course of World War II, but the very nature of modern warfare itself. Legacy of the Desert War. In 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered to Allied troops near Tunis. But the Desert War's influence was only beginning. Its battles had spawned a revolution in military thinking, giving birth to the modern concept of mechanized warfare. The lessons learned in the sand would shape how armies fought for generations to come, from Israel's lightning campaigns to Operation Desert Storm. The vast emptiness of the Sahara had proven the perfect laboratory for testing the limits of mechanized warfare, teaching harsh lessons about the crucial roles of logistics, intelligence, and mobility. The Desert War had also forged a new kind of soldier. The men who fought there, British, German, Australian, Indian, New Zealander, South African, Italian shared a unique bond. They called it the Desert War Code, an unwritten understanding that grew from fighting in such hostile terrain. Enemies rescued each other's stranded crews from certain death by dehydration. Prisoners were treated with unusual respect, their captors knowing they might need the same courtesy tomorrow. Even decades later, veterans from both sides would meet as friends, sharing stories of their time in that unforgiving landscape where man's greatest enemy was often nature itself. But perhaps the Desert War's most enduring legacy was its demonstration that warfare had evolved beyond the genius of individual commanders. Rommel's brilliant tactics and Montgomery's methodical strategy represented competing visions of how to wage war, but in the end, neither proved decisive alone. Victory went to the side that could maintain a steady flow of tanks, fuel, ammunition, and water across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. The desert had taught military planners that modern warfare was as much about ports, pipelines, and supply dumps as it was about tanks, guns, and tactical brilliance. Today, the battlefields of the Desert War lie silent. The sand has swallowed most traces of those epic clashes. But beneath the dunes lie the scattered remains of that great campaign, rusted tanks, shell casings, and the personal effects of young men who fought and died there. Local Bedouins still find dog tags and medallions, poignant reminders of a time when the fate of the world hung in the balance in this remote corner of Africa. The Desert War had changed not just the course of World War II, but our understanding of warfare itself, proving that in the modern age, victory belongs not to the most daring commander, but to the side that best masters the complex machinery of industrial war.